Cholesterol, such a sexy word, right? Well, maybe not, depending on how you look at it. Cholesterol is the backbone of a lot of the sex steroid hormones, so maybe it is sexy. But cholesterol also forms plaques in the walls of arteries, leading to things like cardiovascular disease and erectile dysfunction, so maybe not so sexy. But it's our topic on this week's episode of the Alter Your Health podcast, episode number 62. As always, this podcast is your source of information and inspiration to promote the holistic transformation of your health and the health of our planet. Today, I'm joined with our return guest, Dr. Daniel Chong. Dr. Chong was the guest on Alter Your Health episode number 4, one of the first episodes, and we talked all about healing the heart with food. We had a great conversation over an hour, and somehow we managed to talk about healing the heart with food, but we didn't bring up the huge, crazy topic of cholesterol. So I guess we were thinking ahead, and we're thinking ahead for today, and we saved that topic to dive in and tear apart and understand deeply and intimately what the heck cholesterol is, what it does for the body, what it doesn't do for the body, and why cholesterol is not the most important factor when considering preventing or reversing cardiovascular disease. Yes, that's correct. Cholesterol is not the most important factor when considering preventing or reversing cardiovascular disease. So we're going to dive into this. We're going to get to know cholesterol. And I think that after today, you will be much more of an expert on cholesterol than maybe a lot of people. So some things that I learned that I'll just share with you are that brown bears have cholesterol that are 2 to 3 times the average human cholesterol level. And yet they don't get cardiovascular disease. There's never been a case of a bear having a heart attack. Not that I know of, not that anyone knows of. So that's just an interesting thing to ponder. Well, that just points to the fact, as Dr. Chong eloquently shares throughout this conversation, cholesterol is important, but it's not the most important indicator of cardiovascular risk. So before we dive in, if you're new or if you're a return listener, I would just encourage you to take a few more seconds out of your day to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. The ratings and reviews are really helpful. They provide the feedback I need to learn and grow, either constructive feedback, destructive feedback. I'll take it all, and the intention that I have is always to keep this podcast moving in an upward, positive direction, expanding, learning, growing. So thank you for taking the time and providing that feedback. That helps me. So without further ado, why don't we sit back and enjoy all of the nitty-gritty details about cholesterol with Dr. Daniel Chong. So, Dr. Daniel Chong, welcome back to the Alter Your Health podcast.
Hello, you, Ben, and everybody else. Good to be here. A little different circumstances than last time. No cats in the way.
No cats in the way. We're connecting on Zoom this time, but you're the first guest to come back. So,
am I really?
Yeah.
Wow, I must like you. Something.
It's mutual. It's mutual.
Yes, for sure.
So in our first talk, we obviously talked a lot about food and the heart and eating properly to prevent heart disease. But one thing that we didn't somehow come across at all in our long discussion was cholesterol somehow. And I know that's a huge topic. It confuses a lot. So
that might have been on purpose on my part, because it's a deep dive when we get into cholesterol. So maybe.
Right. Well, here we are. We're able to take that dive a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, round 2.
Maybe could you just start this off by telling us what the heck cholesterol is?
Well, it's a substance found in the body that's used for all kinds of different things. It's absolutely necessary for health. There's always these discussions about what would happen if we just lowered cholesterol to 0. Some of these, I've seen people make this argument in debates, like, well, if you take cholesterol away, look at all the bad things that happen to people. And it's always this like, all or nothing situation, but I mean, it's a crucial, absolutely necessary substance in the body for life. You can't build proper cell membranes without it. So your cells would cease to function, essentially. You can't make many hormones without it. So it's a building block substance, and it's absolutely crucial for life. But that doesn't mean that you have to eat it. We don't actually have a true dietary requirement for it, and people oftentimes have a misunderstanding about that. So they think that it's a necessary nutrient to eat. But unless we have a genetic defect, we make all that we need, and sometimes overproduce it in certain circumstances. But hopefully that answers your question. But there's zero argument that it's an important nutrient. The question always comes with all the debates out there on the internet about cholesterol and health and cardiovascular disease, et cetera. The question always comes, how much of it do we need? How much of it should be floating around in our blood? Whether or not we should even care about how much is floating around in our blood. Those are the question marks that are debatable, but it's not debatable that it's important. And anybody that says it's not is not really thinking about it that clearly. But
so you said that we obviously need it. That's understood. Need it for cell membranes, for hormones, amongst other things. And you said that it can come from our diet. We know that cholesterol is found in animal foods. But if we don't eat animal foods, where does cholesterol come from?
Well, many of our cells can make it. The majority is made in the liver. As far as I can recall, one of the only organ tissues or cells that do not make it are the cells in the adrenal glands. And so technically many of our cells can make it, but our liver makes a large portion of it. What is so interesting to me is, again, when all conditions are normal and you have a varying level of intake of cholesterol in your diet, your body will vary along with that. So, and again, it speaks to the importance of the substance. Your body absolutely needs a certain amount. And so if you don't eat any, your body will make up for whatever you're not eating. If you eat a ton, your cholesterol production tends to go down. Again, unless something is wrong or there's something else driving the production of the cholesterol, but that's basically how it works. And I think that that's an important point to make note of as well, because when you see a situation like that in the body where it will drastically alter its production of something, its elimination of something, its absorption of something based on the intake that it's getting, you know automatically that that is something the body wants to tightly regulate. Your body and whatever designed it is not listening to blog posts or not reading blog posts, right? And it knows it doesn't want too much. And so it does everything it can to keep it regulated. But it also knows that it's crucial for life, so it does everything it can to make sure it never goes to zero, but it doesn't want it just going, to super high levels either.
So let's take a minute before we go too far into this topic to just suss out the different types of cholesterol, because obviously we know the good and the bad,
right?
Like those two classic subtypes, the HDL and the LDL.
Right.
But how can we suss it out further to better understand what's going on when we're looking at cholesterol values?
Well, if we're going to get super technical, then technically everything we're talking about when we're measuring something on a blood test, whether it's HDL or LDL or these other forms that some people may know, IDL and VLDL, those are not cholesterol. Those are protein particles. Cholesterol carrying molecules. Cholesterol, there's only one type. It's just cholesterol. It's cholesterol. It's the thing that changes is what it's being transferred on or transported on.
Totally. Yeah. Right. I took a step already too far. Thanks for bringing me back.
I'm just getting like, to be technically accurate, that's really, even though you'll hear many doctors say, just call it LDL cholesterol or HDL cholesterol or whatever. It is important to recognize that the cholesterol is just the cholesterol. It's a cargo. It's a piece of cargo that's being carried around on on some type of protein molecule. And what protein molecule that is depends on the density of it and how large it is and different things. And that these things will, again, not getting too detailed, but they'll transfer things on and off of themselves and grow in size or shrink in size and that type of thing. So, but the most concerning, quote unquote, bad cholesterol is, or most recognized as LDL cholesterol, because that's the one that most typically gets involved in problematic processes in the arterial walls. And we can make a little sidebar there and note, there's a lot of discussion in some places on the internet about the size of that LDL particle and whether or not it's large and puffy or small and dense. Some people are out there saying that if you have high LDL cholesterol, but it's all, if you do a type of test that breaks down the sizes of those LDL molecules and you find that they're mostly large and puffy, then you don't have to worry about it, they're not atherogenic. That's not accurate. Actually, all LDL molecules can potentially contribute to atherosclerosis. They can all fit readily into the wall of the artery where they can get stuck and start the whole process. But some people sort of have this misconception or misstated in a way that it says, oh, if it's large and puffy, they're too big and they can't get in there. That's not true. All possible sizes of LDL can get into the wall of the artery. And so really the issue comes that there's a strong correlation between problems with metabolism like insulin resistance and that type of thing, inflammation, and small dense LDL. So in other words, people who have blood sugar irregularities or insulin resistance type of situations going on, they tend to have small and dense, a higher percentage of small dense LDL. But really, to tease it out and to tease out the potential risk that somebody has from LDL cholesterol, you have to look at the particle number, not the size. So research has shown that when you splice it out and you look at the particle number versus particle size, particle number is the one that has a larger correlation, a stronger correlation to risk. So an HDL is the classic good cholesterol, even though it's not always good. It gets complicated there too. I mean, it's probably the most complex of all of the cholesterol related molecules. And in general, very generally, we kind of look at it like the garbage collector. So it goes and picks up excess cholesterol and that type of thing and brings it back to the liver for processing when it's too much of it is floating around, so to speak. I always use analogies with my patients and say, if there's a bunch of garbage all over the neighborhood, then we want more garbage trucks to go pick it up. But sometimes those garbage trucks get dysfunctional for various reasons. Sometimes in the face of high levels of inflammation, oxidative stress, they can become dysfunctional and not do their job appropriately. And sometimes in those situations, you'll then see the body kick out more of them. So you'll see sometimes people with quite elevated HDL, much higher than usual, over 100 or whatever. And that's not universally a good sign. It could be a sign that things are dysfunctional and the body's just doing its best to adapt. It really, the bottom line is, for me, it's not this super simple cut and dried picture. It's not this, absolutely sometimes people can have relatively high LDL and not get atherosclerosis. Sometimes people can have very low HDL relative to what would be considered optimal and not get atherosclerosis either. There's been multiple drug trials trying to find ways to increase HDL, and they all have failed. Even though they raise HDL, they don't prevent cardiovascular disease. Sometimes it's harmful. So it's super complicated, just like the rest of the body. So, anybody that's out there just saying, oh, all I do for risk assessment for cardiovascular disease is do a lipid panel, they're going to miss a lot of stuff potentially because it's so complicated.
Well, I'd love to get into some of the other potential things that they'll miss, but first,
Okay, make a note of that.
I'll take a note. But first, I want to understand more. So, does cholesterol directly correspond with increased rates of cardiovascular disease? Cholesterol number.
It's a very cholesterol particle number.
Particle number.
Yeah, the research that I've seen definitely bears that out. It's not, again, you're never going to have 100% correlation where it's like absolutely positively anybody with high LDL particles gets cardiovascular disease. You couldn't go that far. And we can talk about reasons why later. But there's a very strong correlation between LDL particle number and risk. And again, using another analogy, I always tell people, if you imagine having like a chain link fence, right? Standard chain link fence you might find at a baseball park or whatever. And you're standing there and you have a bucket of golf balls. And you're taking these golf balls and you're throwing them at the fence and seeing how many of them you can get through to the other side. Some of them are going to get through. Some of them won't, just because they'll bang into the metal. But they're small enough that certainly some of them will get through. So there's essentially two factors that are going to increase or decrease the potential for those balls to get through. How many you have in the bucket and how tight the spaces are in the chain link fence. So in other words, the smaller the spaces are in the chain link fence, the less likely the golf balls are going to get through. But if you have a massive bucket of golf balls, then you still are increasing the potential. And so from that perspective, if somebody has a massively high LDL particle number, they have a higher chance of some of those particles getting into the wall of the artery, getting stuck, causing a reaction by the body that eventually can lead to plaque. But, and you could argue that in conventional medicine, a lot of the focus is on that. It's on like reducing the number of balls in the bucket. So using a statin drug or some type of cholesterol binding agent in the gut that keeps you from absorbing cholesterol from your cholesterol-laden diet. And so it's really focused on that number, and much less focus is placed on the integrity, so to speak, or the tightness of the chain link fence. But in nutrition, we have a lot of tools that we can use to work on the fence and make it almost impervious to penetration by the balls through the fence. And so, you can see examples of that in the wild, like brown bears. There's a research study I read where they looked at brown bears whose cholesterol level varies during the year between 300 and 600. Sorry, it's total cholesterol level between 3 and 600. 600 is like, that's very, if you saw that in a human, you'd kind of freak out.
Yeah, they'd be on a statin.
Absolutely, at least a statin.
At least a statin.
Right, and yet these bears who spend a portion of the year that high, or at least at 300, there's never been any evidence of a bear having plaque found ever in or a heart attack or anything like that in the wild. And so it's clearly not just what's your total cholesterol, even though the research still shows that the higher it is, the higher the potential is. And then from the other end of the spectrum, you probably heard of the Framingham study out of Massachusetts. It's been going for, I think, over 50 years now. They've had thousands and thousands of people come through that study. And you probably know who Kim Williams is, Dr. Kim Williams, it wasn't Kim Williams. It was the former director of the Framingham study. I saw a quote from him less than 5 years ago, and he said during the initial 40 years where they looked at it, there was not a single person who came through that study who had naturally had levels of total cholesterol below 150 who ended up getting a heart attack. even though there was thousands of people that got heart attacks, there was basically none of them who naturally had cholesterol levels that low actually got a heart attack. And that matches all the epidemiological research that people have done in the past, looking at cultures of people who don't get cardiovascular disease, who don't get heart attacks. Inevitably, they have low cholesterol levels, typically below 150. We can go on and on. That's where Dr. Esselstyn, who you probably know, who wrote Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, his research study was based, again, on those cultures of people who all had cholesterol levels lower than 150. And when he first designed his study, he set that as their goal point. Every patient that came into the study, their goal was to give them the diet that he put them on, whole food, plant-based diet, and with the goal of getting them below 150. And then if they didn't quite get there, they would give them a very low dose of a statin. And the people in his study did amazingly well. So there's this theoretical possibility that is sort of like this magic point below which it makes it very difficult, at least, to get cholesterol. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's two extremes. So at the very least, you could say that because we have those two extremes, where you have these people below 150 who don't seem to get a plaque, but certain animals or whatever who have high cholesterol and they don't get plaque either, there's got to be more to the story than just that. But
so going back to the brown bears, bears with the 300 to 600 cholesterol,
yeah.
Would you say that is because they're eating blueberries all the time? Is that kind of what
technically
the
study didn't. Well, the study didn't tease out why that might be. I have my suspicions. They certainly eat better than the average American most of the year, including a lot of plant food. They'll eat a lot of salmon too. Whether or not that had anything to do with it, it's hard to say. They also technically manufacture their own vitamin C in their bodies. And if you look at some of the research by Matthias Rath and Linus Pauling, there's some strong considerations there that vitamin C has a very potent effect on vulnerability to plaque development, in spite of what the cholesterol is. So that my assumption would be it's a mix of those things. They don't have a lot of stress in their lives. They get a lot of sleep. They're pretty active when they're not hibernating. So I don't think you could technically whittle it down to one thing, but some people would say, I know, if anything, I came across that information from Dr. Rath, who's a big proponent and has researched a lot of vitamin C and cardiovascular disease. And that was kind of his point, is they all make vitamin C. Got it. So, and it is very true that the only animals in research that have ever been studied where they sort of purposefully try to give the animal plaque atherosclerosis like a human would get, the only animal that's ever been easily usable for that type of research is a guinea pig, and they don't make vitamin C either. Whereas mice or rats, the classic lab animals, they do make vitamin C, and they have to genetically alter mice to make them more vulnerable to atherosclerosis. And then, as far as I understand them, they typically, when they put them on a atherogenic diet where they're trying to encourage plaque to develop, they have to genetically alter them and still feed them the equivalent of about 20 to 30 egg yolks a day. Wow. Worth of cholesterol for them to then get plaque.
So for some reason, humans are very susceptible to cardiovascular disease.
We're very good at getting it.
Yeah. We're very good at getting it. And it seems like it has to do with, one, our lack of endogenous vitamin C production. And two, our cholesterol-laden diet, which doesn't necessarily need to be cholesterol-laden. Sure. And three, at least our stress levels that are off the charts for many people.
Right. And, our toxic environment.
Toxins, yeah.
I mean, it is true that the other animals live on this planet too, but we certainly get more exposure to toxins than other animals. And, if it wasn't for Esselstyn and Ornish's research, who are technically, for anybody that doesn't know, are the only doctors that I know of who have done legitimate research to show reversal of atherosclerosis or reversal of plaque in the arteries that was already there, using basically diet alone, or diet and lifestyle alone, at least. No supplements, no real, medications, etc. um, Neither of those, in neither of those situations did they give vitamin C. So they gave foods that were high in vitamin C, so you could argue that people were getting enough. So but I used to get really excited about vitamin C and think it was just like the only thing we really needed to think about. But then I realized, well, yeah, but not the only studies that have ever shown reversal, they didn't give that. So it's got to be multifactorial,
Right.
But vitamin C absolutely plays a crucial role. You can look at all the different effects it has, and it's clear why it would help prevent the situation. But whatever it is that you're doing, and I actually just saw and met with Dr. Esselstyn in person a few months ago, and he now is more like when he first started back in his original research study started in like 1985. And again, the design of that study was to get people below 150 with his diet, and if they didn't go that low, they would give them a statin. Now they don't almost ever give people statins as long as they're adherent to their diet, because he's more convinced that this 150 number is less important to get it all the way down to that if they're eating everything he tells them to eat and not eating the things he says not to eat. And it keeps bearing out over and over again. People do amazingly well with his program. So there's more than one way to peel an apple.
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
but the key things seem to be building a healthy, high integrity vascular wall more than
Yeah,
anything.
that chain link fence.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I remember learning about that vitamin C thing. And I remember, my first thought was, well, why the heck is that? But then I remembered it's very unlikely that God or whoever made us screwed up in
Right.
some way or another. So
Right.
it's
Right.
probably,
You can't ever have a mutation win out, like
yeah,
remain, unless there's a survival advantage to it of some sort, right? And the
so there
argument
must
with
be
vitamin
something to
C,
it.
like if vitamin C is so important, why on earth wouldn't we have died out if we lost the ability to make vitamin C? The argument is that technically is that when you make vitamin C in your body, it uses up a lot of glucose. So in all likelihood, the mutation occurred at a time in pre-human existence where there was tons of lush, sort of high carbohydrate foods available that were very high in vitamin C. Or sorry, I take that back. There's lots of vitamin C
Okay.
available through plant food, but fuel sources, so dense carbohydrates and that type of thing, were not always readily available. So it was actually more of an advantage to not use up so much glucose, because there was still
Mhm.
plenty of vitamin C to eat.
Yeah.
And you see that like with gorillas in the wild, they eat somewhere, they've analyzed their diet. The average like adult gorilla eats like 3 to 4,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day just from the leaves that they consume.
Yeah.
So you could argue that was enough to make it so that the increased glucose availability to the person was actually more of an advantage. But
Yeah.
it's hard to say.
Well, glucose is as important as vitamin C is, glucose is much more important,
Right. Right.
drop dead in an instant without glucose in our body.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I am familiar with some of these theories around cholesterol and plaque formation, and people saying that a plaque is like patchwork on a damaged arterial wall and all these
Yeah.
kind of things. What are
I
your
think I've
thoughts
been
on
known to
these?
say that before.
Yeah, maybe I heard it from you
I don't
or
know.
someone else. But what
It's
are your thoughts around these theories, and why
yeah.
do we form plaques ultimately?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely obviously more complicated than that, but the basic idea is that, and this goes right in with everything we're talking about with vitamin C and that type of thing. But the basic idea is that, like, if it was just if plaque forming was just a result of high cholesterol floating around in the bloodstream, we would expect to see plaque form everywhere equally.
in
right? Like,
in the veins and the
right,
arteries. And,
in veins, arteries, legs, arms, fingers, ears, whatever, right?
yeah,
And yet,
yeah.
when you look at it, the vast majority of plaque that forms in the body forms around the heart, in the carotid arteries in the neck, and a certain portion of the circulation around the brain, and then down the body, wherever there's a bifurcation or a splitting of the vessel into two.
Hmm.
And so the thing that all of those areas have in common is an increase in turbulence of the blood as it's flowing by. So there's an increased potential for erosion or damage that happens to the wall of the artery in those sections. So like the highest turbulence and the highest blood pressure of all in the entire vascular system is going to be right in the arteries that feed right back into the heart with each heartbeat.
The coronary
These
arteries.
branches, yeah, the branch of
Yeah.
the coronary arteries, which branch right off of the aorta
Hmm.
and just like literally like U-turn and go right back into the heart.
Hmm.
So it's this weird, when you think about it, it's like, oh, of course that's why we get so much plaque in those arteries. It's not just random, right? And then the other super common area is in the bifurcation between when you have the common carotid artery come up your neck and it splits into an internal and external portion. Right there's a lot of plaque that happens, and still you're getting, that's coming with each heartbeat. You're getting blood shooting up there pretty fast versus down in your pinky toes or something like that.
Hmm.
If you have a bifurcation in the little artery in your toe, you're not going to get as much plaque formation there. And so the point being, there's plaque forms where there's a higher amount of damage, like period, like that's inarguable. And so it's clearly not random. It's clearly happening in response to this disruption in the integrity of the artery linings there. And so the another way to think about it, you even preceding any like structural damage that happens, from blood flowing by, like cracks or crevices or tears or anything like that, the first thing that happens before any of that is you get dysfunction of the artery right there, or what we call endothelial dysfunction. Things stop behaving like they're supposed to. They stop, that area of the arterial wall becomes less functional, less the immune system in that area works less well. The dilation and stickiness and all these different things change there before you can actually visibly see any plaque forming. And it's still a result of this stress on the wall of the artery. It's not like randomly that area just doesn't work well. It happens that way as a result of the ongoing stress on the wall of the artery. And then things like vitamin C and that type of thing actually have been shown to be part of what makes blood vessels function normally and endothelial function normal. And some other nutrients that you get in plant foods like nitrates help, and arginine, different things help with production of nitric oxide, which is a crucial component of the function of the artery wall. So the bottom line is, you don't, it's not this random. I'm trying to remember what your original question was, but it's not this random event. Oh, you're wondering about the patchwork. So
Yeah.
from that whole idea, people started to theorize. That's the original theory that Linus Pauling and this other Dr. Matthias Rath came up with, was that they think that atherosclerosis is a repair job. It's a backup repair mechanism that's preferable to the body to the blood vessel ripping open, which would make perfect sense, right? In nature, I always tell patients, Mother Nature wants you to last as long as possible. Because if you last as long as possible, it's highly likely that you made babies somewhere along the line, and therefore we're going to get a further propagation of our species. So Mother Nature doesn't care at all if it comes up with a backup mechanism that keeps you from dying quickly when you're young because your blood vessel ripped open, and then has you get a heart attack when you're 65 because you already made babies by then, most likely. And so that's like a perfect alternative situation for Mother Nature. It's like, cool, we used you for what we needed. Now you can go and have a heart attack and that. So from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's very logical. And now some research, again, by Matthias Rath, has shown that that may all be true. It's
Yeah.
pretty early in that world. And so we couldn't, the American Heart Association isn't going to come out tomorrow and say, okay, we changed our official understanding of atherosclerosis, and now we know it's just this repair job to do with vitamin C and nutrition. But maybe someday.
Yeah. So do you think it's possible for someone to be walking around with a cholesterol of 250, 300 and not have atherosclerosis?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah. Like a
I think
bear.
it's right. I mean, I don't think it's going to be for the same reasons exactly, but I mean, I see people in my practice who have pretty high cholesterol. And then, in my practice, I don't stop there. We do imaging and things like that, where we want to
Right.
look and try to verify whether or not there's any structural changes going on. And I do see people with far from optimal LDL cholesterol levels and no apparent plaque that's visible. I just think it's probably going to happen at some point. And some people have genetic tendencies towards atherosclerosis. Other people, in all likelihood, have genetic tendencies that protect them from atherosclerosis in the face of the normal situation that would normally cause it in somebody. And it is also true that if somebody has high LDL cholesterol, that might be a result of a genetic anomaly that's just leading to that accumulation of it in their system, and yet they simultaneously eat super well and have a very highly nutrient dense diet, and they've made their chain link fence taut and tight enough and resilient enough that it doesn't get impacted by the level of cholesterol that might impact somebody else who doesn't have that same diet. So the bottom line with that one is, I always tell people, I would prefer you have low, like if they have high cholesterol, but we do some imaging and they don't have plaque in their arteries, I always tell them, I still would prefer you to have lower cholesterol, because you might lose out eventually. So we want it's such a common disease. I mean, I was just reading, it's like 700 something thousand people die of cardiovascular disease every year, 1 in every 3 people. It's so common. We want to go at every possible angle that we can get at to try to protect them. And so I'm not comforted by a situation where they still have high cholesterol. I'd still prefer to see it lower. I just don't want to shove it down there with a drug. It doesn't tend to work as well.
Yeah. Maybe we should have started this talk by just saying that this is not some obscure disease that we're talking about. We're talking about we're talking about the leading killer in our country, in our society. I mean, and I read somewhere
it doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I read somewhere that most people who drop dead of a heart attack have no prior symptoms.
Right. Right around at least, I think, half of them. Yeah. The first symptom is the heart attack or the sudden death.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the adaptability of the body. Like you don't get that classic chest pain, angina that you see on commercials or whatever, typically, until there's like a greater than at least 50%, maybe closer to 70% blockage in one of those arteries. You're not going to have any symptoms at all. And so that person could have plaque all over the bad areas and have absolutely no idea. And that's why I try to do what I do, which is like get in there early, check for things early, look for subtle signs that don't lead to symptoms. Otherwise you're going to miss tons.
Yes. So I came across a study referenced recently. I don't know if you're familiar with this one. And it was talking about how in our society, about 90% of strokes are ischemic or embolic strokes. So they're plaques that break off and block the flow to the brain. But in a lot of Asian countries, it's kind of flipped, like 90% hemorrhagic from high blood pressure that isn't necessarily but low cholesterol. So there's a lot of turbulent blood flow, but there's not the patchwork maybe happening in the arterial walls. Did I interpret that correctly? What's your take on?
I'm familiar with those findings. I've never seen an exact explanation behind why that is.
Uh-huh.
Some of the certainly one theory that I've seen is that there is a much, in some of these countries, especially Japan, there's typically a higher intake of sodium,
Right.
and there's some potentially, so there's some blood pressure related issues there that are causing increased blood pressure in the brain and making it higher likelihood for a blood vessel to blow than maybe it might be otherwise, even though obviously in America we eat a fair bit of salt too, but at least some people in Japan are eating quite a bit.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I've seen. The other thing, what was it? Well, I mean, it is also true that again, you can't speak for all Japanese, but some people do eat quite a bit of omega-3 fats. And, omega-3 fats are kind of like, at least in our world or in the nutrition world, many people sort of look at them as like almost like a panacea, like, some's good, more is better type of idea, but that's likely not true. And there's probably an amount of the consumption beyond which you start becoming vulnerable to bleeds and excessively thin blood. And I've seen that theorized as well as a contributor to these hemorrhagic stroke situations. So those are the main ones I've come across. I mean, they don't get heart attacks as often either, on average. So maybe there's something going on there with their low cholesterol.
Yeah.
But it
Low
would be
cholesterol,
totally
but high sodium. Yeah.
right. It would be totally theoretical. I've never seen anything specific.
Cool. Yeah.
It's still, to be clear though, it's still the rate of hemorrhagic strokes there is still way lower than, like, they get way more hemorrhagic strokes than ischemic strokes, but the rate of hemorrhagic strokes is still way lower than the amount of ischemic strokes that we get in this country. So it's relatively still, their vascular health is still much better.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. We're not leading the game in vascular health in our world here.
Not even close.
Yeah. Right. So when people have high cholesterol, or high total cholesterol number, high LDL, and they get prescribed a statin, the statin is going to knock down those cholesterol particle numbers, but that that clearly doesn't decrease their risk of cardiovascular disease or stroke, right? There's some studies indicating that statins, while they do lower cholesterol very directly, they don't decrease stroke or heart attack risk.
Right. So, I mean, there are definitely, they're not useless, like if somebody came in and said, I don't want to do anything you tell me to do, but I don't want to get a heart attack, I would say, and they had, even if they didn't have really high cholesterol, I'd say, well, you may as well take a statin if you're not going to do anything else nutritionally, because some research has shown some potential effects. The interesting thing is just like you said, there's absolutely research out there that showed that oftentimes they don't work in spite of how well they lower cholesterol. And so you could stop right there and say, so there has to be other things going on, right?
Yeah. So why? So
well,
can we talk
the other
just
part
for a
of it,
minute about that?
the other part of it is that the research that I've heard of that has shown sort of the highest efficacy or the best effects from statins tend to be when they're given to people who also have a significant amount of chronic inflammation going on. And we know that statin drugs have effects on the body other than lowering cholesterol, that some research are theorizing that if and when they do work, they're working not because they're lowering cholesterol per se, but because they're reducing inflammation, oxidative stress in the walls of the arteries. The key so the other thing to make note of is that they also have been shown to work much better for what's called secondary prevention, where the person's already had an event, a heart attack or a stroke, and then they get put on a statin. Those people who get put on a statin in that situation tend to get less second events than people in the control group who didn't get put on a statin, who also, so in other words, if you have two people that have a heart attack, and then you put one of them on a statin and one of them on a placebo, the person that goes on the statin tends to get less potential for another one. And again, typically those people are more inflamed and have more oxidative stress in their system, that type of thing. So my argument isn't so much against whether or not statins do anything. It's more whether or not there's something else we can do that mimics the effects of statins or works better. And there is, and it's called a healthy diet. So in other words, anything that a statin has ever been found to do positively, other than lower cholesterol, which they're clearly very good at, any of the other potential effects that it has positively on your system are easily replicable with a healthy diet, and more so. So you can anything positive you can get from a statin, you could definitely do better with a really well-planned diet. And that's why Esselstyn and Ornish and these guys have shown that over and over and over again. Nothing has ever worked as well as their diets for preventing or reversing cardiovascular disease.
So the first thing obviously to do is to cut out exogenous cholesterol from the diet. So dietary sources of cholesterol, correct? Is that
the way I would look at it is anything that's potentially injurious to the artery walls. So anything that increases inflammation, stress, damage to the artery walls. So absolutely that would include saturated fat, cholesterol containing foods. We don't know for sure how much of it is the actual cholesterol in those foods that's causing harm, although there have been research studies done where they like radio isotope, I can't remember the term, but they mark the cholesterol in the food.
Carbon label, yeah.
Right, they label it in the food, and then they can later on find that cholesterol in the plaque in the animal. And so it definitely gets in there. But there's still question marks as to whether or not that's the crucial dietary component, or if it's saturated fat itself that's more harmful. And absolutely other types of oils, anything that causes endothelial dysfunction is going to contribute to cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, just pausing you for a second. So saturated fat and cholesterol. Are there foods that have saturated fat that don't have cholesterol? And are there foods that have cholesterol that don't have saturated fat?
Coconut.
Okay, is it
palm oil? So plant-based. So only animal foods have cholesterol, and then within the realm of cholesterol-containing animal foods, you're going to have a varying amount of cholesterol and saturated fat. So, like obviously, like eggs, for example, have a relative to the total amount of like cholesterol content per calorie. Eggs, I think, are the highest. Maybe liver is higher than that, but the key thing is cholesterol is only found in animal food, and yet saturated fat is just pretty much anything that has fat in it is going to have some amount of saturated fat. Even nuts and seeds and avocados and things like that have saturated fat. One of the things that people don't think about, we're like, oh, I just eat the white meat chicken. That has a pretty high amount of cholesterol in it as well, and a decent amount of saturated fat. Even salmon has a decent amount of saturated fat. I've seen people who have certain genetic predispositions to elevated cholesterol. Their cholesterol could go up with just taking a fish oil supplement. So
for sure.
And so there's a question as to whether or not, one of the things that's a crucial thing to think about is what is, if the end point that we're trying to reduce is the cholesterol level in a person, is it the cholesterol they eat that's causing it, or is it the saturated fat that they eat that's causing their cholesterol to go up? And it's not totally clear. But
it's hard to tweeze those things apart, though.
Right, because they pretty much come. I mean, the only way you can really do that is with a research study where you're just giving like purified cholesterol, which would never happen in real life. So that's that whole reductionism idea that I try to stay away from. I just look at the big picture as much as possible. I look at who gets heart attacks and who doesn't, and try to mimic what those people are doing, and don't do what the people who get heart attacks do, and not overthink it too much. So and that's the other thing, is that my bottom line is always what happens in the person that I'm talking to once we do whatever change we decide to do. So I don't care what some other research study says, or a blog says, or another doctor, or whatever. I care what happens in my patient when I have them do what I ask them to do. So if they go on a healthy plant-based diet and their cholesterol doesn't go down or their inflammation doesn't go down or whatever, I don't just like say, well, do it more or whatever. We start to have to look for other things. It's all, the bottom line is always what happens in the patient after we make the change that we make. And so that's why, sometimes I'll have people come in who, for whatever reason, they are devoted to their diet, and it's like whatever, a paleo diet or something like that. And it made them feel great. They were feeling horrible. They were sick. They had autoimmune disease or something like that. And they felt better when they went on that diet. All I say to them is, well, let's check some of these things that I like to check and make sure that it's not harming you in ways that you don't know. Sometimes, because they can't tell, they don't have any symptoms. Their cholesterol's going up, whatever. Their endothelial their endothelial function is getting worse or something like that. If we check them and sometimes they look worse than they would have thought, and I say, this might not be the best match for you. Let's start altering the ratio of plants to animal foods in your diet. Other times I will test people and they look awesome, in every way that I can check. And I can't then still sit there and say, yeah, but you should still not eat this way just because I don't think you should eat this way, because they're devoted to it, So, I always come back to this idea of like rechecking people and just trying to verify objectively what's going on and not get too stuck on my own personal beliefs or whatever that I think or that I've seen or what I want them to do,
Yeah.
So.
Well, because we know those beliefs exist, as we were talking about before we
Yes.
dove in.
Yeah.
But just to maybe like finish things off on dietary interventions to lower cholesterol, and not only lower cholesterol, because we know that cholesterol is obviously not the only factor in creating atherosclerosis and heart disease. So if someone cuts out obviously not all saturated fat, but mostly saturated fat and cholesterol out of their diet, does some sort of Esselstyn program, and their cholesterol isn't going down, does that ever happen? Because I've heard of people saying that it does. Yeah,
I've seen, I mean, certainly some people are more challenging than others I've seen both ends of the spectrum where, people come in, they have everything looks horrible. Their cholesterol's 290 and their inflammation's high and their blood sugar's starting to creep up and everything. They switch to an Esselstyn diet and they come back in 2 months and it's like a totally new person. Like everything just flip flops and looks as perfect as you could hope. And that's more common, or some version of that. But occasionally people don't change the way that we expect. Typically they have a genetic predisposition to elevated cholesterol that doesn't have elevated cholesterol carrying molecules.
So I know that, there's familial hypercholesterolemia, this genetic elevation in cholesterol carrying molecules despite what our diet is.
Right.
But are you saying that there's other kind of genetic variations that there's kind of like on the spectrum?
Yeah, there are different types of, so familial hypercholesterolemia is probably the most well-known genetic condition that really can massively increase cholesterol levels. And people who are like homozygous for that defect, they can get heart attacks in their teens. But there are other ones, like there's one I check very commonly called apolipoprotein E, or ApoE. And there's a version of that. That's not checking for a defect. It's just checking for what version of the gene a person has. There is a version of that gene that can impact how well that person clears LDL from the system. So again, if you look at LDL like a cargo ship, it's got a job. It gets loaded with cholesterol and some different other substances, and that it delivers that to different cells. That's basically what it's supposed to be doing. Once it's done that, it's supposed to be recycled. So it goes back to the liver, and it's supposed to bind onto these LDL receptors that then sort of pull it out of circulation and either break it down or process it in some way, shape, or form. Some people have this ApoE4, which is a version of ApoE, and when they do that, that mechanism doesn't work quite as well. and they
Mhm.
become vulnerable to accumulation. So it's not so much a excessive production issue in those people. They just don't clear it well enough, so it just
Mhm.
starts to accumulate that way. They're sometimes a little more challenging to get the levels to come down.
Mhm.
Um, so that's that is that is an important situation to consider and always assess for. So it's not always this cut and dry, just massive change.
Mhm.
But I would argue, and certainly Esselstyn would argue, those people should, even if you put them on a diet like that and their cholesterol levels don't dramatically change like they often do, they should still be on that diet, because the likely most therapeutic aspect of that diet is the protective effects of the food on the blood
Mhm.
vessels, and the removal of foods that are injuring the artery walls and disrupting endothelial function and making a person vulnerable to plaque formation,
Right.
even if the cholesterol levels don't go down.
Yeah.
So it's not so much this idea of like somebody might say, oh, well, it didn't work because my cholesterol didn't go down, so I don't want to eat that way anymore. It's like, no, 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 you still need to eat that way, especially if you already have shown to be having plaque in your arteries,
Mhm.
because our biggest goal is protecting your arteries and making them as healthy as possible.
Mhm. Yeah, when we're talking about something working or not, we're just looking at one endpoint variable.
Right.
We're really blinded, and we're
Absolutely.
thinking in this reductionistic way. But
Yeah.
obviously, with incorporating more plants, while maybe our endpoint might not be moving the way that we expect or like, there's all these other variables
Right.
that
Right.
are moving that might be might be invisible or
Right.
difficult
Right.
to measure, but we're still bolstering our resilience of our endothelial
Yep.
lining. And yeah,
Yeah.
so that
Now
makes
that
sense. So yeah,
but now that you've come to that conclusion, now I'm going to mess with your head a little bit.
have at it.
Because there is also, in spite of everything that you just very eloquently and accurately stated, um, there is research that's been done, and there's a treatment called LDL Rhesus, where they literally just, it's almost like a dialysis machine for LDL, where they circulate it through this machine, and it literally pulls LDL molecules out of the bloodstream. And
Oh,
so these people who have total cholesterol levels of
that's
over a
crazy. I haven't
thousand
heard of
or
this.
whatever,
Yeah.
and they're just riddled with plaque, they will sometimes use that treatment, and the research shows that the plaque regresses when they do that. And they're not doing anything to improve the health of the
Yeah.
vitality. They're just pulling LDL out, and it still improves. There's also research that shows that if you take an animal who had, like, if you experimentally give an animal plaque, like a rat or whatever, and then you infect it with certain types of parasites that are known to, that their primary food is cholesterol, they also get plaque regression.
Mhm.
So you're literally just like, it is true that if the balls in the bucket are so high that just reducing their numbers by itself and not changing any parameter will still reduce the potential for plaque and the development of plaque. So there's probably some sweet spot below which it's very difficult to get plaque, when we're talking about LDL, and above which you're going to get it no matter what.
Mhm.
And so, it's the perfect example of why it's more complicated than that. So, we should do everything we can. That's why I still tell people, I want to see your cholesterol levels naturally get down as low as possible. I also want you to do things that protect your arteries as much as possible, because it's a multifactorial process.
Mhm. Yeah, so true. So on that note, what are some things to do
Some things to do.
what are some things to do? Obviously, like we said, cutting out the cholesterol and minimizing saturated fat is like number one. But any specific foods that just really lower your cholesterol that you love?
Well, again, I don't think about it more from
Yeah,
a cholesterol lowering
I'm
perspective.
yeah, I'm asking this very mechanical
Right,
question.
right, right, right,
How
right.
can we
I'm
how can we
gonna
dump the balls out of the bucket?
right, right. So I think of two. I guess from a food perspective, I think of,
Yeah.
when we're talking about therapeutic foods, like what we can eat to benefit our health. I'm a big proponent of that versus I try to do as little of like don't, and
Yeah.
as much of like make sure you eat this, make sure you ate that, and the medicinal power of food. Greens are the number one food.
Top notch.
Yeah. So if
Top
I
notch.
have, so I'm not kidding. If I have somebody who has, we have found has high amounts of plaque already in their system, or they already had a heart attack or stroke or whatever, my like probably number one prescription to them is going to be dark leafy green vegetables at least 4 times a day, like a
Whoa.
handful of cooked dark, and that's straight out of the mouth of Esselstyn.
4 times
Who
a
have
day.
at least.
For
He's like,
breakfast, lunch,
if you want to
dinners,
have, yeah,
dessert.
he's quoted as saying, if you want to have a midnight snack of kale, I'm even more excited about it. And one interesting thing about that is if you mix it, there's a little pearl. If you mix those greens with balsamic vinegar, it frees up and makes more bioavailable, one of the key nutritional components that's so good for endothelial function. So he tries to have his patients as often as possible eat as much dark leafy greens as possible, and whenever possible put a little balsamic vinegar on.
So is that the nitrates?
I
What?
Well, there's definitely nitrates in the greens. I don't know that
What's
it's
the
a different
balsamic?
component. I can't remember.
Oh, okay.
I was like hesitant to mention it because I knew you were going to ask what it is. I can't remember the actual component of it, but there's something about that combination that's super that sort of boosts that.
So the greens, when I think about greens and kale and these kind of dark leafies, I'm obviously thinking about the nitrates and the dilation of blood vessels.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about and I'm thinking about antioxidants and just the healing of the endothelial dysfunction. But I also and fiber.
Yeah.
But what about more fiber-rich foods?
Right. So absolutely. I mean, number one, fiber in your going through your gut, especially the soluble fibers and things like that you're going to get from beans and grains and things like that, are important for if a person is still consuming cholesterol, they are going to bind a lot of that cholesterol. But also, it's not just about the consumption of cholesterol. We also dump cholesterol into our own guts as a release mechanism to try to get it out of our bodies.
From the liver, right?
Right. That's something that's not frequently talked about. Bile contains a lot of cholesterol, and it's literally like a elimination route for getting cholesterol out of our system. As we again try to make sure that it doesn't get too high, we're trying to dump cholesterol out of our systems. And so when people eat these super high fat, low carbohydrate diets, they are stimulating bile release into the gut, but then they are not binding it because there's not enough fiber to help carry it all the way out. So it gets reabsorbed. So you get this sort of recirculation. And so fiber is so important for that. And then beyond that, now there's all this research coming out about probiotic organisms and the microbiome and its direct impact on cardiovascular health and all kinds of other health aspects
and stuff.
Yeah, TMAO is another topic for sure. That all of
that's
that,
like a whole nother hour.
Yeah, all of that has to do with fiber-containing foods and the presence of fiber-containing foods in our gut. So the cool thing is that's exactly a perfect example why you don't want to be reductionistic and think, okay, I need to eat my flavonoids, so I'm going to take a bioflavonoid supplement. And okay, I need fiber, so I'm going to take a fiber supplement. You eat a whole food plant-based diet, and you get all of it. It's like this tailor-made treatment to prevent cardiovascular disease, and it's just and all kinds of other diseases as we've seen. So yeah, fiber's multifactorial too. They're all multifactorial, and that's the point.
Yeah. Thanks for I feel like this has been a really kind of mechanical conversation about dumping the balls out of the bucket and cholesterol poking holes in the fence, and
I wouldn't be able to remember it if I didn't come up with these analogies.
but yeah, anyways, thanks for pointing us back to just remembering that all of these things are affecting everything.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And we could again go on forever, but you could say the same thing on the opposite end of the spectrum for these potentially negative foods like animal fats. I get so crazy sometimes when I hear all this back and forth discussion about saturated fat and cholesterol. It's like, what about all the other stuff that comes along with animal foods that doesn't come along with plant foods, like endotoxins, for example, which are like toxins secreted by bacteria that you cannot, it doesn't matter whether or not your piece of meat came from a grass-fed cow or a conventional cow, they're going to have endotoxins in them because you can't not get some bacterial contamination. And these toxins are present regardless of how you cook it, how old it is, how fresh it is, whatever. And they will get into your bloodstream, and they cause all kinds of, they contribute to inflammation, oxidative stress, and all these different things. Animal foods are also a primary, like literally proven to be the #1 source of environmental toxin exposure that we have as human beings, is from the animal foods that we eat. And so it's really so much more than just saturated fat and cholesterol, and whether, that argument's going to continue on forever. But when you start looking at these other things, there's all kinds of other things to consider that, again, don't come into play when the diet is heavily plant-based.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could talk about the environment and talk for 4 more hours.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was gonna weave its way in more, but obviously we had a sticky topic of this cholesterol stuff.
Right. We'll have to do a round 3.
Oh well, we better know it's coming. We know it's coming.
Oh yeah, I'll have the infamous Russell Mars with me next to me.
Oh gosh.
Do a round 3 and talk for 5 hours.
That would be fun. Maybe I've got to get up there. I don't know if we could. I'm just envisioning Russell on Zoom. I feel like
that wouldn't work. It would have to be live. It would have to be live and like one of those motion tracking cameras. Put like a little marker on him and have him like move around. You can track him wherever he goes.
Yeah, we'll do that for sure sometime. Hopefully soon. But before I knock you, I feel like you were kind of on a soapbox for a second, and I want you to finish off whatever it was. If you wanted to hammer something home for us to really understand, we obviously talked about how plant foods are indiscriminatory in terms of how beneficial effects there are, and animal foods are not so for many reasons. But is there anything else that you think is important to hammer home when we're talking about cholesterol, cardiovascular disease prevention, and this topic?
Well, I think more than anything, I would say the awareness of how ubiquitous it is in our environment, and how, no kidding, there's a heart attack and a stroke approximately every 40 seconds, and 1 in every 3 people die of cardiovascular disease. And I hear few naturopathic doctors talking about cardiovascular disease. I hear very few people in the public worried about it or whatever. You see a lot of things about other diseases and things which are important. It's not to diminish their importance, but nobody talks about it. And I think it's part of it is because you don't get symptoms from it. You don't feel pain from your endothelial dysfunction and your plaque forming in your arteries, and it doesn't disrupt your sleep or make you feel tired or whatever, until pretty far along. And so I think the most important thing to drive home is like, this is still, in spite of all of our technological advances and everything that we do, it's killing most people. And everybody should be thoroughly evaluated for it. People argue about mammograms and colonoscopies and things like that and how important they are or not. Everybody should be getting their arteries looked at. Everybody should be getting a thorough, advanced lipid panel done pretty early on to see where they're at. To me, at least by age 40, to get a feel for what their risk level is, because that's doing the bulk of the damage out there. And then they can listen to podcasts like this to figure out what to do if things don't look so good. Yeah.
So I want to remind listeners out there that you do consult with some people online and do some coaching around.
Yeah, I have a clinical practice here in Portland, but I also do a lot of like either videos like this with Zoom video consultations or phone consultations with people who don't have this type of medicine available to them wherever they are. And with this type of medicine, there's not a lot of hands-on work that's done. I'm not sticking needles in people or whatever. And so we can get a ton done, just by talking, and we can get labs run on people and imaging run on people and that type of thing. So I'm out there trying to do my best to try to prevent this disease. And I'm also creating some coaching programs coming out pretty soon, and some workshops and things like that. So maybe round 3 we'll talk about those being done.
Cool. Yeah,
And a
looking
book.
forward to
There's
it.
a
Well,
book coming out.
oh,
Mark my words. I'm
what?
going to be writing a book. Don't ask me when it'll be out, but there is going to be a book that
All
comes
right.
out that
You heard
summarizes
it
all this
first
stuff.
here. You heard it first here on Alter Your Health podcast.
You did. I
Dr.
don't think I've
Chong
actually said
coming
that
out
to
with a book.
anybody. So
All right. Well, people know now.
congratulations.
And yeah, it's already getting dark here now in Southern California. So maybe that means it's time to wrap things up. Go eat our green leafies.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
Got to do it.
Until next time, Dr. Chong.
Yeah,
Peace and
sounds
love.
good. Later, my friend.